Welcome to Doing Business in Africa. I'm Sue Bierkes, and this time we're in Mozambique. Known as the Indian Ocean's Pearl, Mozambique has emerged from a civil war lasting some 2 decades to become one of the world's fastest growing economies. But it's not without its challenges, and we're here to find out what's driving investment, who's making money, and how they're doing it. Coming up in the show, how Mozambique's attracted some mega investors kickstarting its economy after a 17-year civil war to become one of the world's fastest growing countries. Could energy be Mozambique's next golden goose? The global credit squeeze and high interest rates, how can businesses in Mozambique fund expansion? And a look at how a seafood company operating in Mozambique is catching some big contracts. And finally, why tourism in the country isn't just about pristine beaches and wildlife parks. When Mozambique emerged from a 17-year civil war in 1992, its economy was in tatters, infrastructure had been destroyed, and there was no industry to speak of. A peace deal brokered between Frelimo and Renamo put an end to the conflict. At the same time, there were some important developments going on next door. The release of Nelson Mandela from 20 years of imprisonment and the ensuing democracy provided the impetus for further regional stability.
Since the 90s, after the first general election, the multi-party system that was put in place has been recording an average growth of around 80%, which is due mainly to the political stability. So it is a multi-party system with an election each 5 years.
There's nothing new about rapid economic growth following peace agreements in post-conflict countries, but Mozambique did something a little different. It managed to attract the world's biggest miner, BHP Billiton, and Sasol, the world's biggest producer of liquid fuel from coal, who set up mega projects, giving the economy a boost with huge inflows of foreign capital. It's here at the Mozal smelter where more than half of Mozambique's export earnings are generated. It opened its doors in 2000 as the single biggest investment in the country since independence and was really responsible for putting Mozambique on the map as an investment destination.
A project like Mozal had a very important impact in terms of bringing or putting Mozambique in the world map in terms of destination for investment, because if a project of that magnitude could be kind of implemented in Mozambique in short period of time and enjoying all this kind of success in every aspect, that means that the environment is quite conducive.
Mozal is a venture between BHP Billiton, Mitsubishi, South Africa's Industrial Development Corporation, and the government of Mozambique. In 2007, aluminium from this smelter made up 61% of the country's exports. But decreased demand for commodities due to the global economic slowdown has seen aluminium prices drop by 20% over the year. Aluminium smelters are by nature power guzzlers and are set up in areas where electricity comes cheap. And in southern Africa, electricity on average costs a third of what it does in OECD countries. Mozal imports electricity from South Africa's power utility Eskom, which is currently suffering from capacity issues.
We have a long-term power contract with Matraco. Matraco is a joint venture with EDM, which is the Mozambican Power Authority, Eskom in South Africa, and the SEC, which is the Swaziland Electricity Commission. They also own the transmission lines from South Africa, which goes through Swaziland, through Mozambique to Maputo. We were subject to power restrictions following the power restrictions last year, and we've taken our power from Matraco from 950 megawatts down to 915 megawatts. So we've been subject to that constraint, and we therefore are operating at slightly below full capacity at the moment.
But BHP's biggest headache might just prove to be an opportunity.
This business is an energy-intensive user, and that's always going to be potentially the constraint. Now, I know that that's something that Mozambique is probably thinking about a lot. I know the Ministry of Energy are thinking about opportunities, and we'd love to be part of that.
Eskom relies on coal for 90% of its power generation and needs around $52 billion to pay for new power plants. Lucky for Mozambique, it's got one of the world's last untapped coal reserves in its northwest Tete province. Between Brazil's Vale, Australia's Riversdale, and India's Tata Steel, some $2 billion has been pumped into coal projects here. Mozambique hopes the exploitation of the Tete coal basin will make it Africa's second biggest coal producer after South Africa, and generate an annual figure of $1.5 billion when all projects are complete in 2015.
That is now enjoying significant growth, and it is estimated that both projects will contribute to almost about 7% growth in terms of GDP.
This investment, combined with donor inflows, could shelter Mozambique from the worst of the global economic slowdown.
Mozambique is vulnerable, being to the financial crisis, being a country that receives a lot of capital inflows, both in terms of foreign direct investment and in terms of aid flows. Now, in terms of the aid flows, the situation for 2010 seems very stable. In terms of foreign direct investment, Mozambique is in a very fortunate situation because on the one hand they are suffering from a drop in capital inflow. On the other hand, they had very large investments already in the pipeline, mainly for the exploitation of the coal in the Tete region. And this essentially has brought a big inflow in 2009 and will also in 2010 that will more than mitigate the impact of the crisis. So in spite of the financial crisis, Mozambique is still projected to grow around 4.5–5.5%.
Eskom's lack of capacity just might be Riversdale's cash cow. Not only is it sitting on 4 billion tonnes of coal, but it also plans to produce power at its Benga project.
We found that there was a massive shortage in the whole southern African grid, and that's been amplified with Eskom, the South African power supplier, who has been unable to keep up with demand and unable to keep up with the increasing requirement to have much greener power, which means upgrading power stations. So they now have caused a huge industrial problem in the southern African grid by having power shedding. So while we started this project as looking at it as an off-take for our thermal coal, the power components become very important, and we have now been granted by the government the tick of approval to develop the power station, and we've also been granted access to the grid.
Mozambique's government lures investors into economic development zones like Tete with attractive fiscal incentives like duty-free import of capital equipment and tax holidays. In the past, these agreements have caused some conflict between government and miners in other resource-rich African countries. But Mozambique's cautious approach to its mining laws seems to be paying off.
Last year there was a big crash in terms of commodity prices, etc., and most of the mines had to close, like in Zambia and elsewhere, because the new fiscal regime was not kind of supportive enough to make most of this project viable. And I think we in our particular case, we were a bit cautious, and I think the government was quite cautious about addressing these issues. And I have to say that we have a balanced kind of fiscal regime applicable to the mining sector.
Fiscal incentives are, however, a welcome boost for investors who usually have to pump in huge amounts of capital to develop infrastructure to transport their goods. Coal miners in Tete have access to Beira's port via the Senna Railway, but the coal produced here is expected to exceed its rail capacity, so Riversdale is looking at the Zambezi River as an alternative.
Once we, by 2016, get to the order of 20 million tonnes run of mine, we're going to be looking at exporting 10 million tonnes plus. So once we get to that stage, we really do need an alternative. So it's now close to 2 years ago where we started the looking at the river with the understanding that we would require an alternative to the rail. And we now have a very good handle on the river itself. We understand by working with North American and South American barging companies that are quite experts in this field, that we now believe that we have the answers for barging on the river, and that's going to unlock a huge amount of potential.